And by the way, getting back to The Undertaker. Undertaker and I never had a conversation about him going to WCW. Not one. I never asked him. He never say anything about it. Not one.
He made me sick. Those 4 words tell you almost everything about how Vince McMahon viewed certain wrestlers behind the scenes. Vince built WWE into a wrestling empire. He turned small wrestling shows into a giant business that made billions of dollars. He took a regional company and turned it into a company that sold stock on Wall Street. That kind of growth does not happen by accident. It happens because one man controlled almost everything. Every match, every storyline, every dollar, every wrestler. But growing a company that big came with a cost. Vince did not just want talented wrestlers. He wanted wrestlers he could trust completely. He wanted people who would follow the plan, protect the business, and never put their own interests above the company. When a wrestler broke that trust, even once, everything changed for them. Titles disappeared. Pushes stopped. Contracts got rewritten. Some wrestlers were suspended. Some were fired on the spot. This video is not about wrestlers who lacked talent. Every name on this list had something special. Some were main event stars. Some were fan favorites. Some were among the best in-ring performers of their era. What they had in common was different. Each one, at some point, made Vince McMahon stop trusting them. Why did Vince lose trust in some of wrestling's biggest stars? Sometimes it was money. Sometimes it was fear that a wrestler would leave for a rival company. Sometimes it was a wrestler's personal problems spilling into the business. Sometimes it was as simple as Vince deciding a wrestler did not look or sound like a top star. Whatever the reason, the pattern was the same. Vince valued control more than popularity. He valued predictability more than raw talent. He valued obedience more than charisma. We are going to count down 10 wrestlers Vince McMahon never fully trusted. For each one, we will explain how Vince originally believed in them. Then we will explain the exact moment trust broke down. Then we will explain how Vince reacted. And finally, we will explain what that decision meant for the wrestler, for WWE, and for the business as a whole. Some of these stories involve money. Some involve personal struggles. Some involve legal trouble. One even involves outright violence. But every single one connects back to the same underlying question. Could Vince rely on this person completely, in every situation, without hesitation? The moment the answer became no, everything about that wrestler's career changed. By the end, you will understand something important about Vince McMahon. He did not build WWE by trusting people easily. He built it by deciding, again and again, who deserved his trust and who did not. Let's start with the wrestler who sits at number 10. Number 10 is Bret Hart. Known to fans as the Hitman, Bret was one of the most respected technical wrestlers in the business. Vince trusted him with the WWF World Heavyweight Championship, the top prize in the entire company. For years, Bret was seen as a company man. He worked hard, he stayed loyal, he represented WWE around the world with pride, building a reputation as one of the most dependable performers on the entire roster. But in late 1997, everything changed. Bret had signed a new deal with WCW, the biggest rival company at the time. While he prepared to leave, he was still holding the WWF Championship. This made Vince extremely nervous. Vince had already seen a similar situation go wrong before. A wrestler named Medusa had left WWF for WCW, and then dropped the WWF Women's Championship into a trash can on live WCW television. That moment humiliated the company in front of millions of viewers. Vince did not want anything like that to ever happen again. Bret had something powerful in his contract. He had creative control for the final 60 days of his deal. This meant he could refuse certain storylines. Using that power, Bret refused to lose the championship to Shawn Michaels inside Canada, his home country. He did not want to lose his final match in Canada in a way that felt disrespectful to his fans. Vince saw this refusal as a direct threat. He worried that Bret might leave WWF still holding the championship, then show up on WCW television with it, embarrassing the company the same way Medusa had. So Vince made a decision that would follow him for the rest of his career. During Bret's match with Shawn Michaels at the Survivor Series event in Montreal, the referee called for the bell early, without Bret's knowledge or agreement. Bret lost the championship in a match he never actually lost. This moment became known as the Montreal screwjob. The long-term consequences were massive. Bret felt completely betrayed and left the company bitter and angry. For years, he and Vince did not speak, but the impact went far beyond one relationship. WWE permanently changed how it wrote contracts, personal creative control clauses, the kind that gave Bret the power to say no, were eliminated for wrestlers going forward. From that point on, WWE contracts gave management almost total control over storylines, endings, and championship decisions. No single wrestler would ever again have that kind of leverage over the company. The Montreal Screwjob taught Vince a lesson he never forgot. Trust could not depend on a wrestler's word alone. It had to be locked into paperwork. And once a wrestler showed he might use his power against the company, even for personal reasons, that trust was gone for good. Beyond the contracts, this event changed how Vince thought about intellectual property and championship belts. A title was no longer just a prop for a storyline. It was a business asset that had to be protected the same way a company protects its money or its trademarks. Vince came to see any wrestler holding a championship while planning to leave as a serious risk, not just a scheduling problem. This shift in thinking shaped how WWE handled departures for years afterward, with management moving quickly to strip titles from any wrestler who seemed likely to leave, long before an official departure date arrived. It also changed how wrestlers themselves viewed their own leverage. Once word spread about what happened to Bret, many performers realized that a handshake agreement, or even a signed contract clause, might not protect them if Vince believed the business itself was at risk. Trust between talent and management became something that had to be constantly earned, rather than something assumed simply because a wrestler had been loyal in the past. Years of goodwill built through hard work and dedication could be erased in a single moment if the business itself felt threatened, and that reality never fully left the locker room again. That fear of losing control to a departing star did not disappear. In fact, it would return in a very different way years later, with a performer who did not leave for a rival company, but instead simply refused to play by WWE's rules at all. Number 9 is CM Punk, whose real name is Phillip Brooks. Punk became one of the most popular stars in modern WWE history. Fans loved his blunt honesty and his willingness to say things other wrestlers would never say. For a while, Vince saw value in that. Punk's popularity brought in huge numbers of fans, and his merchandise sold extremely well, making him one of the company's most commercially valuable performers at his peak. But Punk's entire personality clashed with how WWE liked to operate. WWE was built around centralized control. Every promo, every storyline, and every decision was supposed to run through management. Punk pushed back against that constantly. He questioned decisions. He spoke his mind about how the company was run. To Vince, this made Punk unpredictable. A wrestler who might say anything at any moment was a risk to a business that depended on careful planning. Because of this, management kept Punk away from the very top spot in the company. Even with his massive popularity, he was never given the closing match at WrestleMania, the biggest show of the year. That spot was reserved for performers management saw as safer, more reliable choices. Punk grew more frustrated over time, feeling like his success on the microphone and in the ring did not matter as much as his willingness to follow orders. He watched other performers, some with far less fan support than he had, get chosen for the spotlight simply because they were seen as easier for management to control. The breaking point came in January 2014. Punk walked away from WWE entirely, frustrated with how he had been treated. The company's response was blunt and personal. WWE delivered him formal termination papers on the very day of his wedding. It was a moment that showed just how far the professional relationship had collapsed. There was no attempt at a graceful exit. There was only a business decision, delivered at the worst possible time. Later, in December 2014, Vince publicly apologized to Punk during a broadcast interview. But Punk rejected the apology completely. The damage was already done, and there was no repairing the relationship at that point. The long-term impact on WWE went beyond just Punk's departure. His outspoken style pushed the company to tighten control even further over what wrestlers were allowed to say. Promos became more centralized, more scripted, and more closely managed by a corporate writer's room. Unscripted moments, the very thing that made Punk so popular with fans, became something WWE tried harder to avoid. Vince wanted performers who could excite crowds without ever threatening to go off script. The Punk situation also affected how WWE viewed outspoken talent as a category, not just Punk as an individual. Management became far more cautious about giving any performer that much creative freedom on the microphone, even performers who had shown loyalty in the past. A single wrestler willing to say unscripted things on live television was now seen as a business threat that needed to be managed carefully, rather than a source of exciting, unpredictable entertainment. Even Vince's public apology years later could not undo how deeply this distrust had settled in. It showed that once a performer was viewed as fundamentally incompatible with the company's corporate structure, no amount of box office success could fully repair that relationship. Punk's departure also became a warning sign to other outspoken talent on the roster, a reminder that speaking too freely, even with the crowd firmly behind you, carried real professional risk inside WWE's chain of command. CM Punk proved that popularity alone could not buy trust. If anything, being too independent-minded made Vince trust a wrestler less, not more. That lesson connects directly to another performer, one who did not challenge the system with words, but with a direct financial threat right before one of the biggest shows of the year. Number 8 is the Ultimate Warrior, whose real name was Jim Hellwig. Warrior was one of the most explosive characters WWE ever created. His intensity and energy made him a huge star, and Vince trusted him with major matches and championships during his rise. That trust reached its peak when Warrior was chosen for one of the promotion's biggest matches of the era. But just before SummerSlam in 1991, that trust was tested in a dramatic way. On July 10, 1991, Warrior sent Vince a handwritten letter. In that letter, he demanded $550,000 as payment connected to WrestleMania 7. He also demanded pay equal to Hulk Hogan, one of the biggest stars in wrestling history. He wanted an equal share of merchandise money, and he wanted changes to his work schedule. Warrior made it clear that if his demands were not met, he would not appear in the SummerSlam main event. This put Vince in an extremely difficult position. SummerSlam was a major pay-per-view event, and pulling Warrior from the main event at the last minute could damage the show and the company's revenue. So Vince made a calculated choice. On July 12, 1991, he sent a written response agreeing to Warrior's demands. He needed the show to go on, and he was willing to say yes in the short term to make sure of that. But Vince did not forget what had happened. The moment the SummerSlam match was finished, on August 27, 1991, Vince handed Warrior a suspension and termination letter. In that letter, he described Warrior as someone who had become, in his words, a legend in his own mind. The message was clear. Vince would give in to pressure only when he had no other choice, and he would remove the threat the second it was safe to do so. The long-term consequences went beyond just Warrior's career. This event pushed WWE toward much stricter contract language. Management began building in clearer rules about what would happen if a wrestler tried similar leverage tactics in the future. Formal protocols around breach of contract became more common, giving the company stronger legal protection the next time a performer tried to use last-minute demands as a bargaining chip. This situation also revealed something important about how Vince separated short-term business needs from long-term personal judgment. In the moment, protecting the live event mattered more than anything else, so Vince was willing to agree to demands he clearly resented. But once the cameras stopped rolling and the revenue was secured, his true feelings came out immediately. Warrior's letter and Vince's calculated response later became one of the most studied examples of this pattern in wrestling business history, showing fans and insiders alike exactly how negotiations worked behind the scenes at the very top of the company. The timing of the firing, immediately after the match rather than before it, made the message unmistakable. Vince would protect the show at any cost, but the moment the show was safe, the wrestler who had threatened it would pay the price. This sequence of events became a lasting example inside the wrestling business of how dangerous it could be to hold a company hostage right before a major event, no matter how much star power a performer believed he carried. The Ultimate Warrior situation showed Vince exactly how dangerous financial leverage could be, especially right before a big show. It also showed how quickly he would act once the danger had passed. That same instinct to protect the business first and deal with personal loyalty second would appear again and again throughout WWE's history, including with a wrestler whose personal struggles, rather than financial demands, made him impossible to fully rely on. Number 7 is Shawn Michaels. During the 1990s, Michaels was widely seen as one of the most gifted in-ring performers WWE had. Vince valued his talent enormously and gave him major championship opportunities. But behind the scenes, Michaels was going through serious personal struggles, and those struggles kept creating problems for the company. Michaels dealt with severe substance dependence during this era. He was also known for explosive backstage arguments and frequent threats to walk away from the company altogether. This combination made him incredibly difficult for management to plan around. A wrestler who might quit at any moment, or who might not be reliable from night to night, created constant uncertainty for a business that depended on long-term planning. Producers who built weeks of storyline around his character never fully knew whether he would show up ready to perform, and that uncertainty spread anxiety through the entire creative team. The clearest example came on February 13, 1997. During a live broadcast, Michaels gave what became known as his "Lost My Smile" speech. He gave up the WWF Championship, citing a knee injury, rather than losing it in a scripted match against Bret Hart at WrestleMania 13 as originally planned. This decision threw WWE's creative plans into chaos. Storylines that had been building for months suddenly had to be reworked with almost no notice. Vince still had personal fondness for Michaels. The two had a long history together, and Vince clearly valued his ability inside the ring. But his trust in Michaels as someone the company could depend on took a serious hit. It would take years, until Michaels made major personal changes in 2002, before that trust began to fully return. The long-term impact of this period pushed WWE to build stronger contingency plans into its storytelling. Instead of relying too heavily on one unpredictable star, management started developing multi-man matches and backup storylines that could survive sudden changes. This gave the company more flexibility if a top performer became unreliable without warning. It also led to stricter management of locker room behavior, since backstage instability had shown it could directly affect what happened on live television. This period also changed how Vince viewed the difference between personal fondness and professional trust. He genuinely cared about Michaels as a person and admired his in-ring ability more than almost anyone else on the roster. Yet that personal connection did not stop Vince from limiting his role during the most unstable years. Business decisions were made based on reliability, not friendship, which showed just how separate those two things had become inside Vince's decision-making process. Only after Michaels rebuilt his life and proved over time that he could be counted on again did Vince fully restore the level of trust he once had in him, showing that this kind of damage, while serious, was not always permanent the way it was for other names on this list. His eventual return to full trust also proved that Vince was capable of forgiveness, but only after seeing consistent, long-term proof that the underlying instability had truly been resolved. Shawn Michaels showed Vince that even the most talented performer could become a liability if his personal life spun out of control. Talent alone was never enough. Reliability mattered just as much, if not more. That same theme, personal struggles undermining a wrestler's ability to be trusted with the top spot, would return again with a different performer, whose in-ring skill was never in question, but whose real-life choices kept getting in the way. Number 6 is Jeff Hardy. Hardy was one of the most naturally popular wrestlers WWE ever had. Fans loved his daring style and his willingness to take huge risks in the ring. Vince recognized that popularity and rewarded Hardy with several runs as world champion over the years. Crowds reacted to him with a passion that few other performers could match, and that connection alone kept management willing to give him chance after chance. But alongside that popularity came a serious problem. Hardy struggled repeatedly with substance abuse, and those struggles kept violating WWE's wellness policy, the company's official drug testing program. Every time Hardy earned back some trust through his performances, another violation would set things back again. The clearest example came in March 2008. Hardy received his second wellness policy violation. Because it was a second offense, WWE handed down an immediate 60-day suspension. This forced Hardy out of the Money in the Bank match at WrestleMania 24, one of the biggest matches on one of the biggest shows of the year. A wrestler who fans wanted to see on the grandest stage was suddenly unavailable because of his own choices. This pattern repeated enough times that it fundamentally changed how management viewed Hardy. No matter how much the crowd loved him, Vince could not fully trust him to anchor the company's biggest storylines long-term. A champion who might suddenly disappear due to a policy violation created too much risk for a business that needed consistency at the top. The long-term consequences reached beyond Hardy himself. His repeated violations, along with similar issues involving other wrestlers, helped push WWE to fully formalize its talent wellness program in 2006. What had once been handled through informal decisions by management became a structured system with mandatory testing, mandatory suspensions, and public reporting requirements. This was designed to protect the company's reputation and its relationships with sponsors and business partners, who did not want to be associated with drug-related scandals. This situation also highlighted a repeated pattern with Hardy specifically. Each time he served a suspension and returned, management often gave him another opportunity, hoping the pattern might finally break. But when the violations kept happening, the risk kept resetting to the same place, and Vince's ability to fully commit to Hardy as a long-term centerpiece stayed permanently limited, even during the periods when he was performing at his absolute best in front of fans. For a company that planned television months in advance, that kind of unpredictability was one of the hardest things for management to work around, no matter how badly the fans wanted to see Hardy in the spotlight. Number 5 is Brock Lesnar. Between 2002 and 2004, WWE invested an enormous amount of money and creative planning into Lesnar. He was positioned as the central figure of the company's future, the wrestler meant to lead WWE into a new era following the Attitude Era. Vince trusted him with the top championship and built major storylines around his dominance. Few wrestlers before him had been given that level of immediate, unquestioned faith so early in their careers, which made what happened next even more painful for the company. Then, in March 2004, Lesnar made a decision that shocked the company. He chose to leave WWE to pursue a career in the NFL. This was not a rival wrestling promotion pulling him away. It was an entirely different sport altogether. WWE had spent years and significant money building Lesnar into a top star, and suddenly that investment walked out the door with almost no warning. The financial and creative damage was severe. Management had built long-term plans around Lesnar as a centerpiece of the roster, and now those plans had to be scrapped. The experience left Vince and the rest of WWE's leadership deeply cautious about ever again investing that heavily in a single full-time performer without protection against a sudden exit. When Lesnar eventually returned to WWE in 2012, the company handled things completely differently. Instead of offering him a traditional full-time contract, WWE built a highly structured, short-term, multi-million-dollar part-time deal. This allowed the company to benefit from Lesnar's drawing power and star quality, while protecting itself from the risk of him disappearing again without warning. Lesnar could still main event major shows, but WWE was no longer exposed the way it had been in 2004. The long-term impact of this situation changed how WWE approached its biggest stars going forward. Rather than depending on a single anchor performer for years at a time, the company shifted toward a model built around risk diversification. Number 4 is Christian, whose real name is William Resso. Christian had strong technical wrestling skill, excellent promo ability, and genuine support from fans. On paper, he had everything a top champion usually needs, but Vince still held persistent doubts about him, specifically about whether Christian looked the part of a true main event star. It was a strange situation for Christian to navigate, since his skill set matched or exceeded many performers who were given far bigger opportunities above him on the card. Vince maintained a deep skepticism about Christian's marketability, based purely on his appearance. Rather than viewing him as a possible top champion, Vince saw him as a mid-card performer, someone useful, but not someone who could carry the company at the very top level. This was not about Christian's ability in the ring. It was about how Vince believed audiences would respond to him visually as the face of the company. This skepticism showed up in a striking way. According to internal reports confirmed by corporate personnel, Vince once pitched a televised idea where a blue dot would be digitally placed over Christian's face during broadcasts, specifically to mask his appearance. This idea captured just how much Vince's doubts centered on looks rather than talent or performance quality. Because of this ongoing bias, Christian's ceiling within WWE stayed limited. No matter how well he performed, he could not fully break through to the top tier of the company. Eventually, this limitation became one of the reasons Christian sought validation in competing wrestling promotions, where he could pursue main event opportunities that WWE was unwilling to give him. The long-term impact of this situation reveals something important about how Vince evaluated talent. Being skilled and popular with fans was not always enough to earn full trust at the top. Vince's own personal judgment about appearance and marketability could override in-ring accomplishments entirely. A performer could do everything right and still be capped by one executive's subjective opinion. This situation also shows how much power Vince held as the single decision-maker at the top of the company. There was no committee to overrule his personal opinion about who looked like a star. If Vince did not see main event quality in a performer's appearance, that judgment alone could shape years of that wrestler's career, regardless of how fans or peers in the locker room actually felt about him. Christian's case remains one of the clearest examples of how subjective, personal judgment at the very top of WWE could outweigh every other measure of a wrestler's value to the company. It also raised a lasting question among fans and analysts alike about how many other performers may have faced similar, quieter ceilings without the story ever becoming public knowledge. Christian's experience shows a very different kind of distrust from the others on this list. It was not about broken contracts or personal scandals. It was about whether Vince personally believed in someone as a face of the brand. Number 3 is Rob Van Dam, often known simply as RVD. In June 2006, Van Dam reached the highest point of his career. Management positioned him as the dual champion, holding both the WWE Championship and the ECW World Heavyweight Championship at the same time, in order to anchor the newly launched ECW brand. This was a major show of trust from a company that had historically seen Van Dam as more of a counterculture figure than a corporate favorite. Reaching that dual championship status felt like validation for a performer who had spent years proving himself outside the traditional main event mold. That trust did not last long. In July 2006, just weeks after becoming a dual champion, Van Dam was suddenly arrested for drug possession. This was a serious problem for WWE, which needed to protect its relationships with sponsors and maintain a certain public image. An arrest involving one of its top champions threatened both of those things at once. Management responded immediately and decisively. Van Dam was ordered to lose both championships on consecutive nights. He then served a 30-day suspension. There was no attempt to quietly manage the situation or protect Van Dam's championship status. The business risk was too high, and Vince prioritized protecting the company's image over protecting Van Dam's spot at the top. The damage to Van Dam's standing within the company was permanent. Before the arrest, he had been positioned as a potential long-term main event star and franchise anchor for ECW. After the arrest, that plan was essentially finished. He never fully returned to that same level of trust within WWE's executive offices. The long-term consequences reached beyond Van Dam individually. Along with other similar incidents involving drug-related issues, this event reinforced how seriously WWE needed to treat public relations and sponsorship risk. It added further pressure towards strict enforcement of the wellness policy sanctions the company had been developing, making sure future violations would be met with immediate and visible consequences. Number 2 is Cesaro, whose real name is Claudio Castagnoli. Cesaro was widely praised by other wrestlers and by fans for his incredible physical strength and his athletic ability inside the ring. Few performers on the roster could match his combination of raw power and precise technical skill in the ring. Despite this, Cesaro never secured the sustained backing from management needed for a true main event push. Highlight reels of his in-ring feats circulated widely among fans, yet none of that admiration seemed to translate into the kind of sustained trust that led to a genuine championship run at the very top of the card. Vince operated under a firm belief that technical skill alone was not enough to make a top star. He believed a wrestler also needed a strong emotional connection with casual fans, the kind of charisma that made someone feel like a can't-miss attraction. In Vince's eyes, Cesaro's in-ring excellence did not translate into that same kind of audience connection. This belief became public during a broadcast of the Steve Austin podcast in December 2014. Vince specifically brought up Cesaro as an example of a broader issue he saw in modern talent. He stated plainly that Cesaro lacked the mic skills and verbal assertiveness needed to, in his words, grab the brass ring. This was the same phrase Vince used to describe the kind of individual initiative he expected from a true main event star. This public assessment had a lasting effect on how Cesaro was used going forward. Rather than being positioned as a singles main event threat, he settled into a role as a high-level tag team specialist and a gatekeeper for other rising stars. His ceiling within the company became effectively locked in place by Vince's own words. The long-term impact of this situation reveals something consistent across many of the names on this list. Vince's personal opinion carried enormous weight, sometimes more weight than a wrestler's actual in-ring ability or physical gifts. Cesaro had the tools that should have made him a star, but without Vince's belief in his charisma, that potential stayed capped. This situation also shows how Vince's own public comments could directly shape a wrestler's career path. By naming Cesaro specifically on a public podcast as an example of a talent who could not grab the brass ring, Vince essentially confirmed to the entire wrestling world what fans had suspected for a while. There was no ambiguity left about where Cesaro stood in the company's plans, and that public statement made it even harder for him to break out of the tag team role he had been placed in. It also showed fans just how much influence one executive's opinion about charisma could have, even over a performer whose in-ring talent was rarely questioned by anyone inside the business. Number 1 is Nailz, whose real name is Kevin Wacholtz. His story stands apart from every other name on this list because it involves something far more serious than a broken storyline or a business disagreement. It involves direct physical violence against Vince himself. In December 1992, Wacholtz entered Vince McMahon's corporate office in Green Bay, Wisconsin. He went there to dispute his financial payout from a recent pay-per-view event. He believed he had not been paid fairly for his work, and he wanted the situation resolved directly with Vince. Going straight to the top of the company, rather than through normal business channels, was itself a sign of how personal and how urgent this dispute felt to him. The conversation did not stay calm for long. The financial disagreement escalated into a violent physical altercation. Wacholtz physically attacked Vince, at one point choking him inside his own office. This was not a scripted moment or a wrestling storyline. It was a real attack on the head of the company, inside the company's own headquarters. Management responded immediately. Wacholtz's contract was terminated on the spot. There was no suspension, no negotiation, and no path back. A physical assault on the company's leader was treated as an absolute and immediate disqualifying event, unlike almost every other situation on this list, where some path toward negotiation or partial trust still existed. The incident did not end there. It escalated further into wrongful termination lawsuits and testimony during federal trials. What began as a dispute over payment for a single event turned into a much larger legal battle that stretched on for years. Wachholtz became remembered not for his in-ring work, but as a case study in total personal and professional liability. The long-term impact of this situation went beyond Wachholtz himself. It pushed WWE to harden its executive security and to establish clearer workplace rules for how disputes between talent and management should be handled. 10 different wrestlers, 10 different reasons for broken trust. Broken trust in wrestling, it turns out, was not always permanent. Sometimes it just took time, change, and proof before the door opened again. So here is the real question worth sitting with. Did Vince McMahon protect WWE by making these decisions? Or did he prevent several genuinely legendary careers from reaching their full potential? Maybe the honest answer is both things can be true at the same time. A business built to last for decades sometimes has to say no to individual greatness, even when that greatness is standing right in front of you. What do you think? Did Vince make the right calls? Or did his need for control cost wrestling some of its biggest stars? The debate continues, and it probably always will, long after the cameras stop.